World War III was a global and ultimately unclear conflict on Earth in the mid-21st century. Over 600 million people died in the war, and human civilization nearly collapsed, resulting in a period known as the post-atomic horror that lasted into the early 22nd century. Historians of later centuries had varying opinions of the exact nature of the war and its origins. Some linked it to the eugenics war of the late 20th century, and while the seeds of the conflict may have been planted then, most scholars agree that it really began with Colonel Philip Green's eco-terrorism in 2026, which resulted in 37 million deaths. Green and his troops executed hundreds of thousands of people with impurities, like radiation sickness, claiming that their deaths were good for future generations. Among other parties in the conflict were the Eastern Coalition, or ECON, which fought against the United States of America and the European Union. Various factions, including Green's cadre, and possibly ECON, used drugs to control their military. Even during this period of global turmoil, the new United Nations worked for peace, and in 2036 declared that no human would be held accountable for the crimes of their race or forebears. However, the group's efforts were met with failure. The mind control revolts of 2043 through 2047 occurred during this period. World War III reached its peak on May 1st, 2053, when nuclear weapons were detonated over London, New York City, Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, Mecca, Beijing, and other cities. Asia was hit hardest, followed by the United States. Nearly 500 million people died in the initial blast. Washington, D.C. and the surrounding 3 states were blown off the map, and Earth was plunged into a nuclear winter that lasted most of the next decade. The post-atomic horror that followed severely destabilized civilizations all over the world, as governments fell, and terrorist groups and rogue states detonated suitcase nukes and released biological weapons. The drug-controlled troops were used as cannon fodder in the conventional ground battles after much of the global computer systems were sabotaged. Numerous small-scale conflicts erupted across the globe. The economy of the United States was devastated, and most of its citizens were reduced to living conditions worse than that of the Great Depression of the 1930s. For 2 months following the outbreak of World War III, Caesar's Palace in Las Vegas served as an operational command center for Colonel Amber's regimental volunteers and was the site of the final battle of the Siege of Las Vegas. When the extent of the devastation became clear, the remaining governments gathered in San Francisco to sign a peace accord. Even so, there were those who wished to keep on fighting, like Colonel Green and others of his ilk. After Green's death, one of his lieutenants, Colonel Adric Thorson, continued terrorist strikes in the name of the Optimum movement, and by the 2070s gained control of Great Britain. The aftermath. First contact with the Vulcans in 2063 inspired new hope in humanity and aided in recovery from the war's effects in some areas. Nevertheless, the post-atomic horror raged on in Asia, the Middle East, and the new Third World, sunk into a total lawlessness. According to Jean-Luc Picard, these areas remained in chaos well into the 22nd century. Gradually, as the post-atomic horror declined, new attempts at unified global alliances sprung up, including the European homogeny, circa 2123. These alliances eventually formed the genesis of the United Earth in 2150. World War III's legacy was far-reaching and continued to be felt 100 years later. The war eventually became a popular subject in the recovered film industry. The philosophy of the neo-transcendentalism was founded to advocate a return to a simpler life, in response to the devastation advanced technology had brought humanity. Other, less benign schools of thought emerged, including xenophobia, exemplified by the Back to Earth movement and its more aggressive cousin, Terra Prime, an outgrowth of Green and Thorson's Optimum philosophy. Ultimately, World War III and First Contact marked the turning point for humanity. In the aftermath, mankind came together, putting aside the differences of race and culture, and unified in a way never before seen.